At Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we continue to record business-related human rights abuses on a daily basis, from workers producing our clothes and food exposed to severe labor exploitation, to Indigenous communities dispossessed of their lands and livelihoods to make way for agribusiness, mining, or even renewable energy projects. Despite some leading companies taking steps to improve conditions in their supply chains, voluntary action is largely proving to be ineffective. According to the latest corporate human rights benchmark, half of the companies assessed scored 0 on all human rights due diligence indicators. Human rights advocates are turning to enforceable regulation to raise the bar, and they are now joined by a growing call from investors for mandatory measures on corporate respect for human rights. On the 25th of November, a significant group of investors have called on governments to develop, implement, and enforce mandatory human rights due diligence requirements. Today, we are here with two of the leaders of this call, Sara Blackwell from the Investor Alliance for Human Rights and Lauren Compere from Boston Common Asset Management. Welcome, Sara and Lauren. Sara, first let me ask you to expand a bit on what is mandatory human rights due diligence legislation and why is it necessary?
Thanks so much, Aniko, and many thanks to the Resource Center for the opportunity to highlight this important effort. Mandatory human rights due diligence is not a terminology that has been made up in the business and human rights space. In terms of due diligence itself, this is a process and a phrase that many companies are already quite familiar with. Due diligence is a longstanding concept that investigative processes for companies have taken place that aim to identify financial risks associated with business transactions. So human rights due diligence is drawing from this process that many companies have undertaken for a long time to focus on risk to people rather than just risk to business. So here, when we talk about risk to people, we're speaking about the most severe or salient risks to human rights. And obviously, where there are material risks to business, there are material risks to people. So there's quite a large convergence here. So I think that's just an important framing for the discussion. Human rights due diligence really is aiming to bring human rights at the center of these longstanding risk management practices for companies. Mandatory human rights due diligence is really highlighting the fact that human rights due diligence on a voluntary basis for companies has not really driven us to where we need to go in corporate respect for human rights. As you highlighted, Aniko, in your introductory remarks, benchmarks like the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark, as well as others that look at specific sectors or issue areas like ranking digital rights, the Know the Chain benchmark, a recent benchmark by BankTrack that's looking at the banking sector, as well as Oxfam's Behind the Brands and Behind the Barcodes benchmarks across the board all show that voluntary measures aren't yet enough. And so with this, we need government action. We need requirements from a legal compliance standpoint for companies to really do these due diligence processes in a robust and meaningful way. And I think it's important here for those who have maybe not been following the discussion very closely of unpacking what human rights due diligence is all about. So a quick rundown of the key steps here. In order for companies to be doing robust due diligence, they need to be assessing the actual and potential human rights impacts that may be caused by a business or to which it may contribute or be linked to through its business relationships. So this continuous and iterative assessment process, as well as prioritizing based on that severity lens, based on saliency as defined under the guiding principles. Then integrating and acting on those findings, particularly with the priority issue areas, getting to the doing, not getting stuck in that assessment process, and then tracking the effectiveness of those actions to make sure that impact is a key component of any corporate practice or process, as well as publicly communicating the company's human rights policies, practices, and outcomes. This is a key component, transparency absolutely being necessary in companies' due diligence processes being increasingly matured and improved upon, because if there's public disclosure around the human rights due diligence that a company is doing, then others can hold them accountable to that. And then another key piece embedded throughout is having a strong human rights policy across the business, embedding that throughout government structures and across the business, not just siloed away in a sustainability or CSR department. Enabling remedy when impacts occur, so playing a role in things being put right when things inevitably may go wrong in certain situations. And then engaging with stakeholders throughout all of these due diligence activities. So just to frame up there, what the key steps are that we're talking about when we're talking about human rights due diligence. And then this mandatory piece is really getting regulations in place at the national level, at the regional level, so that companies that are headquartered or jurisdictioned in those geographies have to conduct this type of process. And so with that, we've seen a number of governments taking this charge on. We have a number of exciting developments across the world regions, but in particular in Europe, in France, we have now the duty of vigilance law requiring companies to conduct human rights due diligence. Switzerland has taken really important steps towards a similar initiative. Finland has committed to pursuing its own type of initiative in this area. And we have similar deliberations going on in Denmark and Norway. And those, I think, really cover this holistic aspect of mandatory human rights due diligence. We also have in some jurisdictions a focus on that transparency and reporting piece. And here you see issue area requirements happening in different jurisdictions, such as in Australia, United Kingdom on modern slavery risks, as well as in the Netherlands on child labor risks. I think this is an important point. We are seeing developments on mandating reporting on human rights assessments and impacts, and that's an important starting point. But we really do need to go beyond with mandatory human rights due diligence and ask that companies not only just report on their impacts and risks, but that they're hitting all of those steps that I mentioned earlier.
Perfect. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for that clarification of steps as well. Could you tell us why investors are supporting this type of regulation?
Absolutely. So here I'll just pause to talk a little bit about who we are at the Investor Alliance. And I think this reflects a little bit of the wave that the investor community is moving towards in terms of supporting these types of efforts. So the Investor Alliance for Human Rights is a membership organization of now about 160 institutional investors. And this includes institutional investors such as asset management firms, asset owners, such as public pension funds, trade union funds, faith-based organizations, university endowments, private wealth, family funds as well. So the whole range of institutional investors. And we collectively, within our membership, represent 18 different countries, strong constituency within the US and Europe, but we have now growing membership in Asia, Latin America, and Africa as well. And collectively, our membership represents $4 trillion in US dollars in assets under management. So I think this is really reflective of the growing understanding that investors have a key role to play in the human rights conversation, but also an appetite for guidance and partnership in really progressing those efforts. So our membership has come together and asked us as the Investor Alliance to develop a statement in support of these types of mandatory human rights due diligence efforts. And so we've done so. And in this statement, we really outline 3 key arguments, if you will, for why the investor community is calling for mandatory human rights due diligence. So just a quick rundown of those. First, mandatory human rights due diligence, our membership sees as materially good for business, investors, and the economy. It's essential in creating uniformity and efficiency as an increasing number of governments are already taking this step. This is already happening, so we need a leveling of the playing field. And then lastly, but definitely not least, is that it's a necessary component for investors in fulfilling our own responsibilities to respect human rights. So for investors, really, our members rely on their portfolio companies doing robust human rights due diligence so that they can live up to their own expectations in fulfilling their responsibilities as well. So I'll just unpack each of these a little bit. Mandatory human rights due diligence being good for business, investors, and the economy. So put simply, this makes good business sense. This type of regulation increases the robustness of corporate risk management processes. And as such, it helps investors achieve higher risk-adjusted returns. And there's growing evidence and good documentation research now that shows that this type of regulation contributes to economic growth. And positive performance on human rights and proactive management of these types of risks to people can also attract investment and procurement opportunities for both companies and governments, and that's beneficial to investors as a result. And I think in this, making this business case, we do have a growing evidence base of institutional investors as well as business associations supporting this type of regulation. So the Business and Human Rights Resource Center has done an excellent job on their mandatory human rights due diligence portal of highlighting this type of business support. So I'll highlight a few examples here. So the National Council in Switzerland voted to support a bill introducing a broad mandatory human rights due diligence regime. And this received backing from 5 major Swiss business associations, as well as a group of 23 institutional investors. And they put out a public statement led by the Ethos Fund, calling for a broad support of this. And then a couple other initiatives to highlight. There are 70 large Dutch pension funds that have signed a covenant with civil society, trade unions, and the Dutch government, committing to worldwide cooperation on promoting human rights due diligence. And there, I think that's really interesting and important to show that this is a multi-stakeholder collaborative effort, and that we're not just seeing one stakeholder group calling for this. Folks are coming together across different stakeholder groups. And I think on that piece, the business case, there's growing evidence, as I mentioned earlier, but I think an important point here is that for governments, public trust can really suffer as these human rights impacts increasingly occur. And that is harmful for business, that's harmful for investors as a result. So again, there's broad incentives across stakeholder groups to push this forward. On the second piece, investors and companies really do require a level playing field as these types of regimes continue to develop worldwide. So as was mentioned before, there are various efforts taking place to progress mandatory human rights due diligence in different jurisdictions. We already have this type of regulation in place in certain countries. And as that continues to happen, investors need a leveling of the playing field. We need to rely on the fact that we're living in a global economy, and so as a result, we are operating our activities, investment activities might be and are across jurisdictions. And for efficiency's sake, for expectation setting, we really do need all governments to be moving in this direction. And then lastly, but definitely not least, as I said before, investors and our membership is working with this idea that investors have their own responsibility to respect human rights under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as the OECD due diligence guidelines for multinational enterprises. And on that last piece, the OECD has put out a specific guidance material for institutional investors, unpacking the key steps of due diligence that they should be engaging with. And so investors increasingly understand that they need to be living up to these expectations, but I think the key question is how. And a key component of that is having portfolio companies, as I mentioned before, be engaging with robust due diligence processes. You really can't have strong investor human rights due diligence without strong due diligence at the portfolio company level. So this is 2 sides of the same coin, in our opinion, and I think for many of our investors as well. So I'll stop there. And those are, yeah, again, I think some key talking points that we're highlighting in our statement, some key reasons why investors are backing this effort. And again, we're already getting really strong support for this statement, and we hope it lends support as well for calls from civil society and business associations and others, and to show that investors are there and supporting these efforts.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for sharing those reasons. That's very helpful as well. Just moving a little bit more broadly, could you comment on why it's important for investors to be adding their voices to standard setting conversations and developments in general?
Absolutely, and I'm really excited to talk about this point because for us at the Investor Alliance, this is a unique space and I think really strong value add that our membership is bringing to the broader business and human rights and responsible investor communities. So for a long time, investor engagement with social justice and human rights issues has been really focused on direct corporate engagement, although there are definitely those who have been bringing their voice to standard setting and policy discussions for a long time. But what we're trying to do at the Investor Alliance is to increase the tent and have the entire investor community lending their voice, lending their leverage to push for human rights due diligence requirements at the government level. So with this, we have 3 different work stream priority areas within the Investor Alliance. The first is focusing on this human rights responsibility piece, so investor responsibility to respect human rights and developing tools and resources for our members to put that into practice in a really concrete way. And the second is supporting direct corporate engagement, so how our members are engaging in company dialogues or filing shareholder resolutions or engaging in the proxy voting system and other tools in their engagement toolbox. But then I think really importantly is this standard setting piece, and that is a whole work stream area for the Investor Alliance, coordinating and supporting our membership in lending their voice to various policy setting agendas. We've done this in various aspects since our inception. For instance, recently our membership came together to submit our recommendations to the Equator Principles process and the review process of that recent draft, pushing for better alignment with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Another example is this past spring, we had investors with nearly 2 trillion in assets under management sign a statement that was made public, but also submitted to European and US legislators, calling for them to develop mandatory human rights due diligence for investors themselves. And I think this is really important to pause and worth noting. So we're hearing from investors a call for mandatory efforts that require them to do due diligence. Investors are asking for this, and not only in terms of reporting, but in terms of investment decision making. And that was around the same time that the EU Sustainable Finance Action Plan was passed at the EU Parliament. So we are seeing impact and progress happening here. So investors, I think, need to increasingly be part of the conversation. It's not just civil society that is calling for these efforts. I think that's really important to note. And at the same time, at the Investor Alliance, we are making sure that our investor submissions and statements and calls for this type of regulation is informed by civil society. And that's a key role that we try to play at the Investor Alliance is making sure that our recommendations are in collaboration with civil society partners, that we're reinforcing one another, that our different experiences and perspectives can be incorporated in the calls to government that we're making individually but collectively as well.
Perfect, thank you very much. And now turning over to Lauren Compere, Managing Director at Boston Common Asset Management, one of the investors signing on to the statement that you mentioned earlier. Lauren, could you share with us what motivated you to engage in the conversation on mandatory human rights due diligence, and maybe comment on some of the key elements of the investor statement as well?
Sure. Thank you very much. So I wanted to maybe pause and just say that, this has been an area I've worked personally and professionally for a very long time. I think the concept of investor stewardship has really evolved over the last 5 years, especially. I think with the OECD coming out with their own guidance for investors around human rights due diligence, really changed the conversation within the investor community. And frankly, we've seen some investors at risk when NGO groups and civil society file complaints through the OECD process, for example, through the national contact points on controversial projects. And so investors themselves have faced scrutiny when lack human rights due diligence has happened. So I think in terms of the way in which we as investors at Boston Common Asset Management look at this, we think it's really important that we do raise the bar in terms of the number of companies providing information on how they're conducting human rights due diligence to support our own efforts to be able to understand in our own portfolios and the companies we invest in across the globe, what are the human rights risks? What does where do we potentially have the ability to engage on human rights impacts, not only individually with companies but also through different coalitions, and frankly, not enough companies are providing robust human rights disclosure. So it's really difficult as an investor. Given the different levels and the different quality of human rights disclosure currently, and so mandatory human rights due diligence, really disclosure would really, as Sara highlighted, level the playing field for us, and also be able to compare like for like within a sector or within a region.
Thank you. And going back to the question that that I raised to Sara as well in terms of policy discussions, could you also comment on, from an investor perspective, why you see it's important for investors to be adding their voices to standard setting discussions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually going to use an example from the climate space because this is an area I've also been quite involved in. I think as we looked at the risks around climate posed in our portfolios across the board, the place where we've actually seen not only better disclosure but better climate performance has actually been in regions where there's been mandatory disclosure. For example, in France, there has been a lot, really almost a rapid change given mandatory disclosure around climate. And then while it's not mandatory in the Netherlands, this idea of a multi-stakeholder group coming together, including the Dutch banks, under the banking covenant, not only are they focusing on climate, but they're also focusing on human rights. And so I really see many of the Dutch banks much more advanced, not only in terms of their disclosure, but also in terms of their human rights performance. As an investor, we have, for more than a decade now, engaged on mandatory disclosure in different jurisdictions on human rights impacts. From the start, looking at the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act in 2010, I actually was part of a multi-stakeholder group dealing with the rulemaking process here in the U.S. with the SEC on conflict minerals, coming together not only with investors but also with companies and civil society to make sure that conflict minerals disclosure was robust. And we've also supported harmonization and alignment around the Modern Day Slavery Acts and also the EU conflict minerals alignment with the US. So I think the reason why we've been so involved in the standard setting and engaging with governments and legislation directly is because we do think standardization, harmonization not only brings, it essentially brings scale and standard disclosure, and allows us, again, for comparability purposes. We're invested in hundreds of companies across the globe, and to have a global standard around human rights due diligence and harmonization, for example, of those of that regulation and disclosure requirements would be great. And I wanted to go back to the standard, why we've been involved in public policy. We think that when you have a robust regulatory environment, and we've seen this time and time again in places like Europe and California, it really accelerates not only the pace of disclosure, but also the pace of actual performance. I'm not saying this happens in all cases, but and it also, frankly, creates kind of a race to the top in some ways. No company wants to be called out as a laggard in terms of disclosure on these issues. So it creates a little bit of a tension and momentum within different sectors around these issues.
Great, thank you. And thank you for reminding us as well that we have come a long way in the discussions from transparency to due diligence. Where do you see key opportunities within the next year for governments to take concrete action on mandating human rights due diligence?
Great, thanks for that question. I also wanted to go back and remind us that there's actually been almost a decade of guidance under the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And a few years later, in 2015, further guidance with the reporting framework that came out, developed by Shift and Mazars from the UK. So I think there's been an evolution of tools around not only disclosure, but human rights due diligence, practices. And so I think now is really the time to take kind of those voluntary initiatives and really accelerate the pace of change. So I think, especially as we look at 2020 kind of as a pivotal year on a whole range of issues, right? From both climate and human rights and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, really this next decade is really critical, not only for looking at how companies and governments can achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and achieve the more ambitious guidelines that'll have to be put out around climate and achieving the Paris Agreement. But these human rights due diligence and human rights performance really underpin the achievement of both of those goals, both of the transition to a low carbon future, as well as the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so I think this is a year of action. We need to really look at 2020 as the opportunity to pivot, right? And to really accelerate the pace of change, both on the way in which companies are looking at their human rights exposure and the way in which they can influence and mitigate human rights impacts, but also investors. The trajectory and the definition and the scope of investor stewardship actions across the globe have really evolved and changed. And we now see more investors looking at human rights through a governance lens. This is something that I wrote about it back in 2015. And I do really think that we're seeing more investors come to understand the integrated approach that needs to be taken for investments in terms of looking at not only environment, social, and governance issues as an integration process. And human rights really sits quite squarely in that process, and it's really critical. You can't look at and analyze and assess environment in isolation without also looking at S, and human rights is a big component of social.
Thank you, and thank you both really for these rich insights and for all your work in this field. We look forward to seeing further developments on this in the coming year. As Lauren, you pointed out, it will be a pivotal year for not only for human rights, but also climate and the SDGs. And in the meantime, look out for the investor statement on mandatory human rights due diligence, and feel free to get in touch with the Investor Alliance for Human Rights if you would like to sign on. You can also follow the latest news on mandatory human rights due diligence legislation on the Business and Human Rights Resource Center's website and weekly update newsletters. Thank you very much.